Our special guest for the June Zeal Call is Sheila Warren from the World Economic Forum. Earlier this year, the WEF announced the Presidio Principles. And these principles is an organizing document to help organizations, companies, institutions think through how to protect users in the design of decentralized applications. ECC was among the first signatories of this application, along with a host of kind of really other impressive and forward-thinking organizations. So Sheila today is going to walk us through what these principles are, how they came to be, and also explain how these guidelines can help the future development of decentralized technologies. Sheila, thank you so much for taking time out of your super busy schedule to talk to the Zcash community.
Yeah, of course, Elena, and thanks so much for having me. I have to say, it was really, I don't often get to sit in on calls like this, so it was really fun to hear everything that's going on in the community. And as usual, I remain very impressed by the Zcash community. So I thought I would start by just kind of giving you all a little bit of a history as to how we came to craft principles like this in the first place, and kind of what our goal was in releasing these. So a little over a year ago, we created something we call the Global Blockchain Council. And this was in keeping with the forum's general approach. It was a multi-stakeholder group of individuals that reflected a variety of perspectives on blockchain technology and decentralized technologies as a general matter. And we tried actually really hard to bring together people that had very strong opinions and views and who didn't necessarily agree with each other. And that we wanted to kind of see that friction. So Zuko agreed to join our council, and we're really grateful for the leadership of ECC. And I think we also had, people that represented Ethereum protocol. We had some kind of hardcore Bitcoiners. We had some enterprise people, some governments, a couple civil society representatives. And we tried to also make this representative of different positions. So everything from like maximalists to skeptics, but also different use cases and geographies. Again, it was this really kind of very diverse group. When we all got together back when you could do that in person last year, we kind of talked about like what we wanted to accomplish as a group, like what was something that we could do that might be unique. And we realized that there really wasn't a set of principles, we didn't know what we were going to call it at the time, that was really about creating some accountability in the space. And we kind of talked through the idea that, look, we all kind of opened this, we kind of entered this space because we had certain notions about decentralization, about intermediaries, about how we could build a better world. But there wasn't really a way to think across different protocol about that. And if anything, there was a lot of infighting about like which protocol for what and this kind of thing still happening. Now, we recognized that I'll just own up front, right? There's a certain irony in any kind of centralized group creating any sort of guidance on decentralized principles. We are well
Somebody's got to do it.
Yeah, but that's that kind of thing. We were like, if we can do this in a way that reflects a variety of perspectives and takes into consideration, at least we have a shot at creating something that could be universally relatable, if not actionable. Okay, so over the course of time, we sort of wrestled with, does this need to be something where there is an accountability board or body? We thought that was really too far to the stance of having centralization yet again within this. We thought this was really about the community looking after itself and agreeing where relevant that certain of the principles might apply. We agreed, therefore, that the document ought to be very aspirational in nature. It isn't necessarily something that I actually think, and I'll just say this up front, I don't think it's possible to actually adhere to every single one of the principles that we outlined. It's really directional. It's like, what is our goal as a community over time? What should that be? And yes, we do think there is an aspect of this where members of a community could actually hold themselves and others accountable for approaching, adherence to these principles or not. And to the extent that someone signed up for these, we think there could be an element of accountability and engagement that could happen if it certainly turned out that the things that were actually happening in reality were directly in conflict with this document. That's kind of where things started, and then we released them. Oh gosh, I should know this. time blurs together, right?
I
During
think
the
it was
pandemic.
April. Yeah, I
Okay,
think
I
it
was like,
was
I know it was
April.
after we were all sheltering in place. March, April, it all blurs together.
Yeah.
April, you're right. We released them in April. And since then, we've had a lot of people just sign up for this. We are having guidance documents be issued. So one of the things here is we said, look, I mean, this is think about it like almost like kind of a constitution sort of thing. And then the guidance documents that different protocol could issue could say, oh, here is how we think in the X community these principles actually apply, because there are differences. We think they're as appropriate and applicable to enterprise blockchain, to private permission systems, as they are to permissionless systems. But the nature of how you'd engage and instantiate them will differ, obviously. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna share my screen and just do a quick run through of.
And let me know if you have, okay, yeah, looks like you're sharing your screen.
Yeah, okay.
I wanted to before you go into the run through,
yeah.
kind of the way that these principles, when I first read them, the way it occurred to me was like, okay, what if before social networks had kicked off, a group of people could kind of say, all right, what are some community principles, or what are some overarching guiding principles about collecting data or sharing network information, or even addictive behavior, which I think a lot of product developers have optimized for, because that's how you get kind of more users and more eyeballs. So that kind of, to me, seemed like we recognize, and WEF has taken the leadership and understanding we're still at the beginning of blockchain and decentralized systems. What if we could, and let's go ahead and just kind of organize around a few key ideas that we can all agree to, or key values. I don't know if that's exactly what you had in mind, but it's certainly kind of what I came away with when I first saw this news.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think you nailed it. I think it's really this, for us, it was kind of this question around how do you create something that is meant to precede, development in a sense, right? And recognizing that most projects are well in flight, we still thought, yes, what if there could be this guidepost, this set of almost signals that you were kind of moving in the right direction. And I want to add one thing, which hadn't really come up in the conversation, but this fundamentally is about inclusion. It's about ensuring, right? Because this is not about protocol. Let me be really clear about that. This is not about, like, we're not going in and saying protocol should. We're talking about an application layer. And the idea is that we were seeing an awful lot of projects that were basically like stripping away all the benefits of decentralization in the first place by creating such incredibly centralized systems on top of a decentralized protocol. And while I don't think that, I think that's done with the best of intentions, we were concerned down the line about like blockchain washing. You know what I mean? Where you could kind of say, oh, look, my backend is a decentralized protocol, but then what you're actually doing is so incredibly not that way.
Are you referring to one project in particular?
Maybe
there's more than one example that starts with
I think there are examples of this,
has that astrological vibe.
So I think it's just kind of an interesting phenomenon when you see that happening. And we thought, shouldn't there be a way to kind of shed a light on that? And again, I'm not saying that that is necessarily a bad thing, but there ought to be a way to flag it, and to kind of say, hey, participant in this ecosystem, like, are you aware that the application that you are working with actually is quite highly centralized and has kind of more of an extractive, typical model, as opposed to truly embedding principles of decentralization into it, to the extent that that's possible. I understand that depending on what you're building, sometimes you're accountable to an external, regulator or whatever. So there's always going to be some mitigation in some cases. But again, we thought that the goal here was to preserve the underlying, decentralization, and to do that as much as possible, and that these principles could help provide some sort of, again, guidepost to ensure that the signaling there was correct. So, okay. So what I'll do then is, well, actually, maybe what I'll do is quickly go to, let me just create another tab here and show this really fast. So this was actually our press release that we issued. And I think you can kind of see, like, I'll just, I think I'm actually going to call on my colleague. Samantha, could you just kind of throw this into the chat for me? That would be great. But But you can kind of see, like, I'll just kind of, the highlighted names here give you a sense of council membership and the kind of diversity of opinions that were reflected here, right? So we've got like a whole bunch, and there's Zuko, of course. Victor's from the, he's the president's advisor in the country of Colombia who's signed on. OECD is here. You know, we've got investors, we've got enterprise. So it's just a whole bunch of different groups. We've got, you know, Ethereum Foundation, Consensus. It's just a whole bunch of different kinds of groups that all came together and did review cycles on the document. So they have input into the document itself. And we put this up on GitHub, you know, to kind of get more open source feedback because we felt that community wasn't being represented well enough. And Melton Demirs and Amber Balde kind of helped us coalesce that feedback. We did rounds with various governments. We did rounds in different geographies. We kind of just did a bunch of kind of efforts beyond the council to get feedback from various groups we thought would be interested and reflected. So that's some of that. Okay. So let me just kind of scroll down past this kind of, so the preamble, I actually think the preamble is important. And what we're finding is people kind of skipping over this, but I will encourage you when you kind of do your own deep dive into this to pay attention to this, because it does reflect some of what I've said. This idea that it's about application, not protocol, and we're not coming for anyone's, like, you know, we're not coming for Satoshi and the Bitcoin lyric, everyone relax, you know, not that. It talks about the audience, which really is very, very broad. So we have, you can sign on as an organization, which of course ECC, Zcash has done, and as an individual. And we think it's really important that we get both sides, because this is something that we think, my personal belief is that when it comes to kind of equity inclusion in technology, it is a personal responsibility of everyone in an ecosystem. So every developer, everybody who's kind of working in this space, whether you're working on communications, whether you're working on sales, whatever you're doing, has a responsibility to think about participants, to think about community build, and to think about who you're actually creating power structures for. And part of the goal, I think, of all of us is to kind of create new systems of power, to empower participants in these systems that have historically been left out of the decision-making authority, right? That's kind of like why we're all in this space. And I think not everyone, but I think many of us, most of us, are in this space for those reasons. And so we think it's really important that that responsibility lie at the individual level, not just at the kind of company level. So that's really important to us. And again, you know, governments have signed on to this, like all kinds of different institutions, not just those who are actually building in a space, but those who are kind of on the other side, doing procurements and others. Okay, so we broke this up. It pretty quickly became clear that we were gonna, I'm scrolling and probably what's making me dizzy, into 4 different pillars. So those are transparency and accessibility, agency and interoperability, privacy and security, and accountability and governance. And of course, as with any, you know, division, these are not clean, you know, things. So there are some things here that we had a lot of argument. Does this go in agency and interoperability? Does it go in privacy? Where does it go? But we kind of landed on a set of 16 different principles that we broke out into these different areas, because we figured that people would recognize themselves in one of the 4 primarily and focus kind of there in terms of a place to start. So again, I'll just kind of scroll. These are 2 of the pillars, and here are the other 2. Okay.
And I love how, well, I just want to kind of also think about, I love how this can also be a litmus test for people new to the space, thinking like, okay, this might be a guidepost for how I can think about kind of how decentralized the system is. Yeah. Maybe you don't hit all 16, but like right off the bat, a project like the Petro coin from the Maduro regime in Venezuela, like, would not score very well across these 16 principles. And having that type of kind of guidepost or scorecard, I think is really helpful, especially since a lot of this technology is experimental, it is theoretical. Yeah. And so you have some people like the research team at ECC, they're pushing the boundary on and also researchers on Bitcoin and a lot of other, they're really pushing the boundary on what this technology can do. But then you have people who may be overstating, like, oh, I'm working on this new thing. It can do all kinds of fun bells and whistles. And so I think that's another powerful way to think about these principles.
Yeah, I agree with that. You know, when I first started here, so this team was created at the forum in 2017, and I came here to kind of basically hire everyone, create the team. And so for a little while, it was just me. And so the first thing I did, I joined in the fall of 2017. And so we all know what was happening then. And then we were in like ICO craziness. So in 2018, we wrote a paper called Blockchain Beyond the Hype. And what we were trying to establish was kind of leveraging the forum's neutrality, like the Swiss brand, right? Like really carries forward. And to say, like, I am very, to be clear, I and the forum are very bullish on this technology, like very. But I've always thought it was kind of a longer term play than a lot of people were saying in like 2015 to 2018, let's say. You know, I thought it was a longer term play. And that ultimately, I do believe that our society, our tech is going to really have a blockchain layer in the stack. You know, I think that's going to become almost like a ordinary sort of thing that we don't really think about very much. But I think we're not quite there yet. And to your point, it's because there's a lot of novelty still in this space, and that's great. That's exciting. It's where we should be. But it also means that it's very hard for those who don't understand the technology, the underlying technology, to really get what's unique about it and different, particularly when what they're seeing is highly centralized kind of applications built on top of the layer. So my goal with our work is to ensure that those who are not technical experts, technically minded, you know, some policymakers and others can access what's novel and what's exciting about this technology without needing to deeply understand, you know, how it works, but to have a general sense of it. And I think you're right, Elena, that, you know, really looking at these principles, I think helps articulate like what is different about this and what is special about this in a way that kind of can help anybody who's going into like a vendor, you know, kind of situation, do an evaluation that again, doesn't require like this super, you could actually ask a group, like, are you following the Presidio Principles, or what is your take on them, or which of them do you think are most important? They're just things that you can do to use almost as a conversation starter. And we have seen that already being done by a couple of different policymakers who want to kind of use it as an entry point to say, we're paying attention, you know, we may not be technical experts, but we do understand what this ought to look like. And so we want to know what your reactions are to this. And when they get kind of a response, that's not a great sign, you know? So we're hoping that over time, as adoption becomes more and more widespread, this will become that sort of initial conversation starter for those when you're connecting across like technical and policy kind of lines. And you'll be able to kind of say, okay, we are a project that, you know, principles 7, 8, 10, whatever, are really, really critical to us. Whereas principles, whatever, are maybe like not as relevant to our particular, what we're doing this particular, you know, experiment, but here's how we accommodate them. And here's how we plan to kind of think about them going forward. And I do think that differentiation like that is going to become important as well, because as noted, not all 16 are relevant to every application, you know, nor would they need to be. I'm looking right here at like number 5, right? That's going to be more relevant to some than to others. The one about how you're storing cryptographic keys is going to be relevant to some projects, possibly more than others, for example. You know, interesting thing that came up that I'll kind of highlight is intersection with data regulation, so GDPR specifically, right? And so when the first draft of this, funnily enough, was basically like lifting GDPR and kind of like, where do we intersect? Where's there friction? You know,
put a blockchain on GDPR.
I mean, you know what I mean? Yeah. And then we were like, no, there's enough about that. It doesn't really need to be about that. And we're kind of thinking ahead, I would say, to a world where, you know, we all assume GDPR, there's this kind of baseline assumption of GDPR, any regulation is going to last forever. I think as we've seen in the United States, that is not true. Laws change, often not for the better, you know, all the time. And so we kind of tried to draft this to be more evergreen, to say, even if, you know, GDPR changed or whatever, there are certain aspects of it that we think are really important. And there are certain things about it that we actually think that the way blockchain approaches things are more important. So how do you kind of draft that? So how do you kind of pull those things together? So I'll note that we did not draft this necessarily assuming adherence to any particular data regulation. CCPA is another one. There's obviously things that Rwanda is about to release a new data protection regulation. Brazil is going to launch one. So there's lots of happening around India. Well. Exactly. Mm-hmm. And we were like, we needed to be, you know, agnostic to those things. Yeah.
So one thing I was going to ask, well, and if you could also scroll to the bottom quadrant, so we see transparent. So one thing that I think can be really exciting, but really hard for a company to like it's an interesting topic to explore, but it's really hard for a company to explore that in the public because of like accountability and some other concerns. But my question is around like grappling with things that seem to be mutually exclusive, but maybe they're not. So transparency and accountability and privacy and security, like can these two things exist in the same bucket? What does it look like? I think some people make the assumption that these are mutually exclusive when I firmly believe that they're not, but I think it's worth debating. Like it is worth talking about how they are and are not like complementary values. And so I'm wondering, like in the signatories that you approached, how did they talk about, you know, the difference between or the tension between something like privacy and transparency, or even something like individual agency and governance and accountability? Like it seems like these are kind of two sides of the same coin, but oftentimes that's where people either make legislation that's GDPR, it's a privacy law, it's not a transparency law, or earn it, it's an encryption law, it's not a law to talk about anything else. So where does the WEF see those conversations going?
Yeah, oh my God, I'm so glad you asked. So the other thing that I run, so yeah, you nailed it. If I could have teed that up, I would have, let me tell you. I should have thought of that in advance anyway, but thank you. So in addition to the blockchain and digital assets side of the house, I also now run our data side. So we have a whole data policy team. And that's one of the reasons I kind of, you know, talk about this a little bit more. And the connection there should be obvious. There's so much synergy between these things, right? So I actually, just to back up a second, I actually got into this space not through the fintech side or the money side, but actually through the data side, like thinking about enhanced security around data and immutability around data and how that was really important. Because I'd seen manipulation of data be used, you know, to very, very bad ends by, well, in one case by a government with civil society data, and it was really troubling and problematic. So that's how I got into the whole space. So, you know, I agree with you. I mean, as there's more and more data fragmentation, we're seeing the debates by policymakers and regulators really be about this tension between, you know, privacy and transparency and all of that. And I mean, yeah, that's one axis of trade-off, but like you say, it isn't necessarily a black and white trade-off. Like it's not like the spectrum is not as clean. You don't move, there's all kinds of different vectors that intersect there.
It's not a zero-sum equation.
It's not exactly.
Like more privacy does not equal less transparency.
You're not moving a line like the, you know, it's not like a volume, you know, button. So we're trying to really have that conversation more explicitly with regulators and with at the country level, like people who are kind of putting into place some of these laws, and to say, you know, there really needs to be this more holistic consideration around how you're thinking about data. And so one thing that my sort of other team just released was this document called, it's a roadmap to cross-border data flows. And it actually talks about country level readiness. So the premise here is if you actually want your citizens to be able to engage in the global data economy, the digital economy, you actually need to be thinking about how are you enabling their access to that economy in a cross-border kind of way. There's all kinds of things that are happening right now around the world, data jurisdiction laws, you know, where you kind of like source data and you kind of port the restrictions or whatever it might be, the permissioning around that data across a jurisdictional line without actually sharing it, because you can use different federated data models and things like this, right, to kind of get access to that data. But in our minds, the regulation doesn't reflect that. And we're trying to encourage a lot of these countries to sort of slow down their super territorial sovereign data ownership approach to things and think about what technologies like blockchain could actually enable and provide, and to think about and really, really investigate new encryption models as they are arising and how those models might actually enable self-sovereign identity and ownership of data in ways that could actually eliminate almost some of the need for that regulation, and where that regulation can actually stymie some of the innovation that we're seeing in the tech, and the tech could actually be better at solving some of those issues. So it's kind of bringing these strands together and having those broader conversations at the national, international level.
Nice. We have a question from Aaron in the chat, but just to your point on innovation, like something thing that I'm really looking forward to. It's not just because I work at Zcash, but I think the possibility for zero knowledge proof applications, like beyond cryptocurrencies or blockchain, it's just you can see a world where those type of applications become so much more widespread because people just prefer to validate a statement mathematically rather than exchanging a lot of sensitive data.
Exactly.
Okay, so Aaron asks, what are some examples of the best companies that you have seen that have data science components and then also strong privacy and security principles? She offers Computable.io or Numerai, but oh yeah, and then I think in regards to that question, it's what's difficult when she's talking to VCs that invest in emerging tech is they see the values, but they don't see companies that are profitable, and therefore, while they think like, oh yeah, this is really valuable, I'll go ahead and sign the Presidio Principles, I'm not actually going to put any money into developing the space. I'm paraphrasing what Aaron said, but that's the question.
So, you know, a couple of things. We do have a couple of VC that we've been talking with very closely, including two that actually provided significant input to the document, that are going to be issuing guidance documents about how they would like to see their portfolio companies, basically, or potential portfolio companies, engaging with these principles and what's important to them. So I do think that that was really heavy on our minds, was an idea that there could be a differentiation in terms of, you know, again, it's not necessarily like a how decentralized are you? It's more like how much are you thinking about participant rights? And the more you're thinking about participant rights, the more we think, the more novel your application is, you know, because again, like if you're just building something super centralized, there becomes a fundamental question about whether or not this is really something that is truly innovative, let's say, right? So that was kind of a big part of this. And I will say that those guidance documents are, you know, they're being drafted right now. And we do expect to see other VC join on to this kind of concept and notion. In terms of, I'm just going to go into the chat so I can actually see the specific question again.
Yeah, you'll have to scroll up.
Yeah, oh, I see. Yeah,
to like 145.
Yeah. So, okay, so unfortunately I can't name names. I will confirm that I know, that the ones you said are ones that we certainly track and think are great. I'll also note that we have a cybersecurity team that works out of our Geneva office that thinks a lot about this. So I'll confirm it's an area we think is really, really important. But I'll also tell you, like when I talk to a number of VCs, I mean, they're also thinking about this a lot. They just don't know how to differentiate. It's not from, and this is what they tell me. It's not that they don't think this is an important area, and it's not that they don't understand how critical it is that they don't really understand yet how to differentiate. And I think part of that is that we as a community are not necessarily doing a good job in holding ourselves accountable, you know, in that differentiation. So part of what we're hoping is that these principles can help that and can serve as a mechanism for objectively and gently indicating, you know, where there is, where certain applications are, let's say, more or less in compliance with the principle. That would serve as like a signal.
Yeah, I think also one of the things that we don't talk about enough, and maybe this will be another Zeal call in the future, is just the business model has changed, right? Like the business model for so long in an analog world was like, if I can sell you something for cheaper than it cost me to make it, like boom, I'm Rockefeller. And then it became, well, if I have the platform and I can just collect data, I can give it to you for free. And then here we are today, like people looking out into the horizon are seeing like, well, we have this new way of arriving to consensus, or, you know, kind of deliberating across a lot of nodes in a very diverse network. What would the business model that fuels that system look like? And it's like, surprise, surprise, it's not ICOs from 2017. But time flew by today, so shame on us. This should have been a 2-hour talk. But for the last question, this is a Zcash community call, and I wanted to get your perspective on, you know, how do you think these principles apply to the work that Zcash might be doing. And if it's too specific, we can also go a little bit broader. Like, how would you encourage like the developers on this call or the team members at ECC to think about the work that we're doing in advancing these values that we obviously share because we signed these principles. So how would we kind of bring these into practice?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I one of the things I was going to ask at the end was to say if there are resources that we can help create or structure that would be useful. You know, we do have this guidance document notion where various communities are coming together and kind of almost co-creating examples of how they're thinking about this. For us, you know, we almost see like we have a whole, I think I can pull this up. Well, probably not. We have a whole, there's like a how to implement this, you know, kind of thing that we also created that I don't think is on this page. That's not, maybe I'm going to ask somebody to put that in the chat too. But there's a whole list of like, what do you do with this? And if you're a developer, what do you do? And if you're a funder, what do you do? And if you're a government, what do you do? And if you're enterprise, you know, it kind of lists out these different examples of things that people can actually do concretely to implement the principles. But our view is that for, maybe I can just pull it up if I go into the chat quickly. But yeah, I think, thanks, Amanda, I appreciate it. Okay, can you see that? So here you can see, so it's this whole section on how to use this document, right? So there's this, anybody, here's the one for private developers and service providers, right? So part of this is that we're like, this can give you language and shorthand to discuss, you know, in your sprints, like, how does this fit in with that? And like, and again, we're not saying like you always have to go towards the side of adherence to the principles, but we certainly think that if you're not, it should be a conversation that you're having, and there should be some intentionality around it. And if you're kind of doing something that is out of compliance or against the spirit of one of the principles, we think it's really important to have a conversation as a community about whether that's the right direction. We think that these principles can serve as gating. We're already seeing that. We're seeing funders that are starting to use these as gating, kind of doing an examination of these principles against a particular potential portfolio company and seeing, you know, if they meet and adhere. We have seen developers that are doing that similarly. They're actually creating sprints around the principles, like a Presidio sprint, essentially, where they're like, okay, now we're doing this check to ensure that our direction, you know, is kind of here. And they're doing that at multiple times throughout their process where they go into production. So we're seeing that kind of be interesting. We're also seeing just KPI development around this. You know, should it be that we are using this as kind of a measure, whether that comes up in performance evaluations, like how are you considering these principles? You know, we're seeing some of that start as well. So at every level, we're also seeing on the comms and marketing and even sales side, people starting to say, look, we are, you know, these principles, we're very proud to say that we are a Presidio Principles, you know, kind of organization, and we're thinking about that all the time, and here is how we use it within our work. And to us, you know, because of the nature of how these were created and the intended universality of them, we feel like there's opportunity to be flexible within each community around how you're implementing them. We think the important thing to do is to observe them and think about, for anything that you're doing, like, how do these apply or not? So I think, I hope I'm kind of answering your question, Elena. I'm probably a little bit.
This is very tactical. No, this is great. And I think it's also timely because it's the end of the quarter. We're planning for the next quarter. And it's just always good to see kind of like, what resources are other people working on? What resources have we agreed to? How can we look at it in different ways? I think there's a lot of food for thought. I also really appreciate you taking your time to talk to us, because I think sometimes we can get into our little tunnel vision of like, oh, if it's not related to like the next upgrade or this anonymity set or this pool, then I don't have brain space for it. But the Presidio Principles gives us a really nice framework to step back and look and also compare kind of apples to oranges to decentralized ledgers. So thank you again. I wanted to give people kind of like one last chance to shout out in the doc. I know we only have just a couple of minutes left. One thing that Cameron mentioned that I told him we would bring up in the Q&A, it's kind of like dropping a bomb in the last 2 minutes, but I think because it is timely as it relates to blockchain, sorry, I'm having some background noise, but Sheila, how do you think about like big global powers like China, who are on the one hand kind of pushing forward the envelope of digital central bank-backed digital currencies, but then also maybe not adhering to the values and the principles with certain laws or some certain practices that we're seeing? How much do these principles stay within the realm of blockchain, or how much can they be applied to a broader set of digital governance and digital products?
So, okay, great question. A couple of
I
things.
know,
So
right at the
all,
end.
yeah, I'm like, we're going to run a little long. I hope that's okay. So I think that, okay, a couple of things. So first of all, as you know, many CBDCs are being issued that don't engage a blockchain at all. So that's a whole thing, and we'll just put that out there. Okay, so I think that's important to recognize. There is, I think, still this perception that any CBDC issuance is a blockchain-backed issuance, and that is absolutely not the case. So just, one thing. So in many cases, they're not even claiming. Secondly, I think that these principles give us an objective way to call out certain challenges that we are seeing in many projects. I think, China CBDC is kind of one example, but I think there are several others. And so this gives us a way to say we're not kind of, we're not creating unfair accountability. It's kind of, it's a universal system. And all we're saying is that in order to truly take advantage of the benefits and the novelty of a blockchain, you do need to be focusing on these principles as you build out the application layer. Otherwise, the question becomes very fairly, should you be using some other underlying technology? And it's not that we're saying the application is bad or whatever. We're just saying, right, the blockchain might be irrelevant to what you're actually doing. And that can be actually helpful in some cases. I think for some people, it can be very helpful to say, oh, I need not actually invest in a blockchain. I could just use something else that is already highly centralized because what I want to build is actually that. So we actually think that there's a number of different ways this can play. And in the case of China, I think it's well known what the general orientation towards things like privacy, or transparency might be, right? So even if you look at just the 4 categories here, you can kind of get a sense of where that agency, where applications might fall that are built within that kind of environment. And the question then becomes, yes, there's a tremendous amount of blockchain innovation happening in this space, but to the extent that that is at the application layer, are we really able to take advantage of the major benefits of the technology or not? And in some cases, I think the answer is yes, because it's not considered any kind of threat to the system, right? The transparency and everything there is really about increased efficiency, reduction of friction, like things like that. They're not like threatening to any sort of existing power structure, for example. And that's true. I'm taking that apart from China. That's true all over the place. In some cases, that the very nature of a blockchain is in of itself threatening to those systems. And that, so it enables us to kind of call out the system without having to do that as directly and to get another angle on it. Now, at the forum, we have no problem calling out systems directly. So, but not everyone is in the position that we're in and is going to have the ability to do that. So we thought this language would enable people to make those arguments without having to go direct, which in some cases can actually be literally threatening to people's lives or to people's ability to operate within a system.
Yeah, so to their business model, for sure.
Exactly right. So this kind of gives you that, well, the forum issued these principles and they are based on da-da-da. It's like we're looking at that document to help us create that accountability mechanism without us necessarily having to be the ones that we're just pointing out, like, oh, what about principle 5? We're just asking questions. So we thought that community, almost peer-to-peer ability to hold accountability was really important. Both developer to developer, but also system to system, protocol to protocol, application to application, and frankly, country to country.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Okay, I think we have to end on that note.
Okay.
But thank you, Sheila, also Sumeda, anyone else from the World Economic Forum who joined the call, for helping exchange the links. And we will post a recording of this talk on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. We didn't get to all of the questions, so any questions that we didn't get to, I will post in the forum. Sheila, thank you again for taking the time. I think it's so helpful just to have you walk us through kind of like soup to nuts how these principles came to be. And then I look forward to seeing who else signs on to them and how we can collaborate with the broader set of signatories.
Well, thank you. This was really fun. It was a great pleasure. And if there are questions, as somebody to put in the chat, don't hesitate to reach out to us and let us know how we can help.
Nice. Okay. Well, that's it for today's Zeal call, and we'll see you all next month. Bye, everybody.
Bye.